Assalamu alaikum, y'all. How are y'all? Hey, I saw another podcast salaming their audience, and I said, why don't I do that? Like, I know maybe not all of y'all are Muslim, but I talk enough about Islam that I feel like I might as well give you guys your rights. Okay, I'm going to confess this is my second recording of this topic just because I felt like I was really not getting into the topic the way I wanted to and felt a bit stressed essentially because I'm talking about a topic I have thought about forever. The topic is ego. So one of the things that happened is as I went through hardship, I had to realize, and we talked about this in 3 or 4 episodes, how I view myself is completely different from how I felt like I should, especially when push comes to shove, when you have hard things going on. You're holding on to strings and everything is going like liquid. It's falling out of your hand and you're like, girl, I don't know what I'm supposed to identify with. I don't know what drives me as a person. So today we're going to talk about ego and how sometimes that can be our driver, and we should, if we have time before hardship, run away from that. If not, at least acknowledge during hardship and start to pivot into a better version of ourselves. Hi, this is Jamila with Hardship with Ease. I created this podcast because I went through my hardship that constantly challenged who I was and everything about myself, and I struggled to find direction, guidance to really understand and start thinking about myself and all the ways that make me me, whether it's being a Muslim, a woman of color, a middle child, or a perfectionist and overachiever, as well as a people pleaser, someone with insecurities who thinks a lot, and most of all, a crybaby. So that's where this podcast comes in. It is now a central space to start building tools and building advice to figure out what you want to do, not what others want you to do, and start living a little more intentionally. And during hardship, at the bare minimum, survive each hardship, and on the brighter side, grow a little. Okay, so ego. Listen, some words, when you get into the thick of it, have too many definitions, too many things. So we're going to break this off into 2 parts. One, historical, simple. It literally means I inside of Latin. And so it has some type of history with a bunch of psychologists like Freud really taking this idea of trying to come up with this concept of self, which we talked extensively about the identity episode. And I'm not going to go all the way into that because that is way too much work. But think of it as the I. So one thing I want to say is I actually don't look at ego in that light or that definition. And there's a bunch of other definitions online, but I'm not even going to lie. I found a Reddit post that kind of reflected what I was thinking, and I'm going to just share that with you like a snippet. Essentially, it is how you look at the world outside of you and all the good things, not the things that you don't like or disagree with. It's more of what is good and what do you like. And they said it is a point in your life that is really focused on making you feel good, making you feel safe, making you feel justified. And it doesn't matter if it's based in reality. Okay? Literally, that's exactly what I was going to talk about, so clearly I'm on the right track. But the way you look at ego is this concept of self that you perceive others perceive you as, or kind of like the self-image you look in the mirror of and you constantly compare yourself to, and that self-image is rooted in things outside of you. So it's not what's in you and makes you you, it's more of this checklist, this ideals that you have that come from things outside of you that think this is what you should be like, and you start internalizing it, whether that's from family members, from TV shows, from your own culture, whatever you internalize. And it's essentially you looking outside of yourself of what you should be and act and all of that. So ego is not necessarily a bad thing in my opinion, but it can become bad if you're not aware of what an ego is, or constantly checking yourself to make sure that it's rooted in reality and not delusion. That is also to bring up a side conversation that's really tight in self-esteem. We all know what it is. It's kind of how you view yourself or how much you love yourself. And if you have not heard about why self-esteem is so important, I don't think you went to public school throughout any of the 2000s or the 90s or even the 80s at this point. And it's really like this idea of like your self-worth, like your value, how great you are. So think about how that mirrors this sense of self that's external, ego. So one thing I really bring up is ego constantly is tied to things outside of you a lot of times, which isn't a bad thing. But because of that, a lot of your validation can either come externally from things that are directly people telling you things, or externally for you to reason like this is rational. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But one way to kind of think about your ego and understand it a bit more is to think about like how the validation happens and how pride like ties into that. There's this concept of superiority and inferiority complex, and it was some random girl, she was talking about how these two things tie together. And I'm gonna take a little bit of that and go a little farther. But she talks about this idea of constantly wanting to either be superior, or when you slip out of superiority, you fall into inferiority complex. And with those two things, it constantly, in my opinion, surrounds the other person, surrounds the things around you, kind of that ego in a sense. And I think it's really rooted in ego because you're constantly looking at others, and if you see somebody's doing better than you and you feel some type of way about that, that's ego, because you're looking at whatever self-image you created and you're analyzing, like, this is not adding up, I should be better than her. When you step out of ego, you don't really analyze that person at all. You don't think about that person. You don't try to one-up them. You don't think about superiority. You could easily see somebody on the same timeline not having any of the things you have, and you wouldn't feel a sense of pride that you did better than that person. There's no pride or any analyzation of like your position against that person's position. And listen, if you're Muslim, tap in, because one thing about Islam is like that entire concept of arrogance and comparison is literally against the religion, and it can take you out of the fold of Islam. So like this whole idea of ego following, like, you know, people say it's like the devil, but essentially it is like you're constantly not appreciating what's in front of you. You're constantly thinking about what's outside of you. And the other thing is really rationalizing is that huge factor. Like you're rationalizing why is this person better than me? Why is this, like, you're starting to think about these things. You feel bad and then you start to interpret it more. It's not really about the feeling bad. You can always feel inferior or like, you know, to somebody, but it's when you start to think about it and start to rationalize it, that's when you start moving into the ego category. Because the goal is always to win. Like, you're using something else as a goalpost. So just think about, like, if you want to check yourself personally and just figure it out, that superiority and inferiority complex, really helpful. It's not going to come out all the time, but, you know, it's there. Another thing to think about is a very simple example of like, okay, now you're telling me everything I do is for like others and I'm trying to validate myself. How can I even tell? I like to think of the favorite sweater complex versus the Prada sweater. Let's say you have a favorite sweater. It's a little raggedy, but you love her. She feels nice. She looks cute in your eyes. You know, it's really something internally you took to yourself. While the Prada jacket is like, because it's Prada. So if you found out like your favorite jacket, you thought it was like made out of cotton this whole time, and now it's like polyester, but it feels so nice, it cleans so nice, you might not like feel your reality shattered with that relationship of the jacket. However, like if you got that Prada jacket and it's not Prada anymore, you're gonna feel some type of way. You know, you're gonna feel like, girl, I was wearing this because it was Prada, not because like X, Y, and Z factors. And to be fair, you might have a Prada jacket and you find out it's not Prada, but you still love it anyway. But the real point of that example is, you know, you had to validate why you wanted that thing. And as soon as that validation disappears, you either fall into this like despair, like, oh my God, or this like, I need to revalidate it in a different way, right? So peep this. We're going to bring in another layer, action, into understanding how does ego or self-worth and self-esteem really tie in. So I like to think that ego is that big like part or evil part of self-esteem. So a lot of times when there was research going into self-esteem, Like literally in the 1980s, California put like $200,000 to start boosting people's self-esteem, thinking this would stop crime, pregnancy rates, like drug addiction, like this entire thing, that if we just make people feel better about themselves, like, they'll stop being bad, they'll do good things. But at the same time, if there's no action behind that, right? If I'm constantly telling you, you're a good person, you're a good person, you're a good person, right? What happens when the action's online? And the big problem with, and like a huge danger of just words without meaning, like affirmations without true meaning behind them, in my opinion, is you start to build that ego instead of building your actual self-worth, your actual self-esteem, because you're building up this whole idea, this whole identity with no action behind it. So if I call myself a cow and I don't move, I don't make, like, you're delusional essentially to everybody else, but to you, you're like, no, bro, I am a cow because I do X, Y, like, I made this up in my head. Maybe the cow is not a great example, but y'all get what I'm saying. And if you really think about it, like having those external, validations, or the fact that our society is heavily word-based, like praising, everyone claims values constantly, and if you didn't watch the value episode, go watch it. But if you're like saying, I'm a good person, I'm a da-da-da, like whatever it is, or I'm really respectful, but you start to act out of line with that, right? What does that make you? So that's where we move into like ego and identity. So it was a lot of research that took on this idea of, if we start boosting children at a young age, telling them they're so smart and amazing, right? One, they tend to do worse. Literally, they tend to do worse when you lie to them. Secondary thing is, they start making these action, like this concept, their identity, not the actions, the concept, their identity. So if you tell a student they're really smart, they're all A student, when they fail, right? A test. Because you know what? They didn't study that day. It was a little harder. Or you have somebody who was an influencer and then they flop. They flop for a minute. What happens to you? Somebody who says they're religious, but let's say their actions start not aligning with them. There is this whole research that when they fall hard. It's including their self-esteem. Like they fall hard, and it is a struggle for them to get back up compared to those who didn't tie their self-worth to these identities. Let me say that again. If you call yourself an all-A student and you make your whole personality of being an all-A student and you fail, you're going to struggle harder than a student who was also an all-A student, or maybe a B student who's just worried about doing the action of, you know what, I got to take this test. It doesn't matter if I fail or not. Like, I studied, I tried my best, whatever. When I understood that concept recently, and this is why I was like, oh my God, I actually really do need to do that episode on ego. I started to realize, without action behind that understanding, that identity, you in for a mess. You in for a mess. You're a very fragile state. And, people might tell you, fake it till you make it, be confident, right? But I think what differentiates, true self-worth and ego is, what is that confidence backed by? Is it delusion or is it action, right? Is it action 24/7? Is it action once in a while? Are you holding on to that identity and then putting the actions afterwards and you feel really bad, but it's like a spiral essentially. So just when it comes to confidence, yes, fake it till you make it, but fake the process until you get comfortable with it, not fake the confidence in this identity that you have nothing to do with. And that brings up self-efficacy, of course, doing the action. And let's talk about quick, I'm gonna bring the real world in for a second. Specifically, we constantly have this attitude, we're constantly told to be identify. First of all, we're constantly told to have labels and identity, and I will talk every single episode about this. We're constantly told to have these identities. We're constantly told that if you don't act within that identity, you start to spiral, right? You can't just do things. It has to be an identity. And that might be, once again, because social media we are seeing everything visually, so we start to categorize everything visually. Like, clearly you're a goth girl because you wear goth, not because you just wear it once in a while. You gotta be goth, you gotta commit. And it really makes like kind of a fragile ego, because you are not really doing anything out of, devotion, innovation, just a process, just the actions. Because, actions speak louder than words, y'all. Action. That needs to be subtext slogan of this podcast at this point. But if you just put a little action behind it, right? What could you do that would make it more important to you? I know. If you did it, like, if you had self-efficacy, maybe, like, identity wouldn't be a huge thing for you. It would be more about the learning process. Because I think we think, like, YouTuber. You don't make YouTube videos. You are a YouTuber. Because what happens if you, like, that's two different concepts. Like, if I decide I want to stop making this podcast, right? Don't call me a podcaster. I am not a podcaster, y'all. I just make a podcast. Because if I decide tomorrow I'm not doing this, I'm not doing it. Because this is not my identity. But when you tie it to your identity, that's harder. And if we roll it back to ego, because we're talking about ego, you're going to feel devastated. You'll feel devastated. And especially, like, I look at my views, for example. My views are crap. Yo, there's like one or two of y'all listening. But it's not really, this is a hobby. This is not something that I'm looking towards to, like, fulfill my life. I would love it to, but I'm not trying to do all of that. And if we move into, like, hardship and thinking about all of this, when you go through a hard time, if you have your identity, because I personally had my identity rooted in my self-image that was based on the identity of things I did. Does that make sense? Like, that, not even the things I did, things I thought that were me, whether it's being a good student, being a hard worker, right? Like, I took these so-called values that I thought were my values, and I made that my personality. And I was like, yeah, I'm motivated, I'm intentional, I do all these things. But a lot of it was, like, constantly being validated outside of myself. And girl, like, once you lose those identity factors, like, you're identifying with things. And I kept, like, really struggling because it definitely came from a place of ego getting bigger and bigger. And we're going to talk about one more concept now that we're talking about hardship. Sometimes what happens when it doesn't align, right? Let's say, like, you have this whole concept. Especially, I know, I'm going to say narcissists. Some narcissists be like, I'm a good person. But then their actions don't align with that whole I'm a good person thing. You start to rationalize and double down on idiotic behavior. Like, and that's respectfully. And I say that because I definitely have done that before. That's, like, the whole self-pity episode is about that concept of doubling down on dumb behavior because you don't want to take responsibility of your actions. You're so obsessed with this identity that you're not looking at your actual actions. Like, that's ego. That's ego talking. Ego is obsessed with this identity. It's obsessed with this mirror. Ego does not care about your being as a person. It just cares about you fulfilling this concept it has. And whether you get validated from people outside of you, that being the job you have or the people who care about you or whatever it is, it doesn't necessarily have to be people, right? And your ego's like, yep, you saw that, and it's kind of talking you into it. And because ego is a rationalization of your feelings after the fact, it's not what's happening currently. It's how you be like, yeah, and she was a bitch for that. Like, whatever you do afterwards to make yourself feel better, you really have to step out of this concept and realize when you're doing things to comfort yourself. Like, it's not bad to feel hurt and to comfort yourself. But as we talked about in the self-pity episode, another promo, I'm going to keep doing that because, guys, I'm putting hours into this. So every hour I put into here, I'm definitely going to refer back to it. Anyway, in the self-pity episode, a lot of the self-pity mechanisms really come from that self-preservation, that self-protection, because you can't bear to think about the fact that you might be a bad person. You can't bear to think about the fact that you might have been wrong in a certain situation. And that's ego. Like, that's ego talking, that's ego protecting you. It's a defense mechanism. And I'm never saying that you won't ever have ego. I'm never saying like go like conquer, because people talk about like conquering ego, da da da. Like even like at one point in my hardship, I really had like essentially an ego death that I realized. Like that mirror shattered. That mirror of comparison, that mirror of rationalization shattered. That no matter if I looked outside, there was nothing I could do to validate myself. And it was like at a crossroad of either you go down to the Lulu town, you just start being delusional and be like, you know what, yeah, fuck you. Or you start being like, all right, you know what, let's put the mirror to rest. Let's actually start thinking about things and reflecting in a more healthy way instead of, trying to make myself feel better. And it will hurt. It will hurt, it will hurt, it will hurt. And I think that's what really one of the biggest things that hurt during hardship is hardship can be easy if you decide to let your ego talk. I'm just saying. I'm just saying, Mona Lisa. Like, you could just really let your ego talk. You could just be delusional. Look at Kanye. Kanye had some of the best reflections about his society and the people around him and himself in his earlier music. And he started to slide into what he is now. And before, yes, mental illness, and I 100% am not downplaying that, but before all of that, right, you had a period of his life when, unfortunately, not to say Kim's a bad person, but when he was with Kim Kardashian, that he constantly was like creating this validation that everything he did was right, right? And he had an ego death at some point that, life was not aligning. And he decided to double down. He decided to double down because when he was making Yeezys and all that, that was his, like, everybody was hyping him up. When he was talking against Bush, like, people were hyping him up for his thoughts. And it started to slowly become Kanye and not his actual thoughts. And that happens a lot to, like, celebrities and influencers, that they start off with just people liking those thoughts that they're saying. And there's a point in time where people stop liking those thoughts, and it's either like a offensive thing to that person because it's like, you liked me, now you don't like me. And it's like, no, they liked your thoughts, they didn't like you the whole time. And that's very hurtful to say. And I'll say, like, there might be a point in time in this podcast, like, I'm juiced up, I'm all spent, I'm not hitting like I used to, right? And that's like a part of life, and ego really tries to protect you from that. And I'm just like talking about all of this in like the concept of ego because this is not necessarily a solution episode to like how to solve having the ego. It's just more of acknowledging and knowing that you have that ego and moving forward. So when it comes to hardship, when it comes to you being outside of hardship but having that moment of ego, right? A big reflection is to, instead of to validate yourself when you're hurt, of saying, yeah, you know what, fuck them, I was right, just validate that you were hurt. I feel bad for being bad, like I did something bad. And it's not identity. You don't have to be like, I'm a bad person, I'm bad. It's more of like, I fucked up, I fucked up. But that's okay, like, acknowledge it. I mean, that's a lesson I recently learned. We'll talk about that next episode, I guess. But just being like, you know what, I did mess up. I did F up. And it doesn't exonerate you from the thing you did, or it doesn't like make you a bad person. It also doesn't mean that the other person didn't have any faults. But ego is such a defense mechanism. Like, you're going to be like, well, they came at me crazy. I messed up, but you came at me crazy. You did this, you did that. Like, it's like such a crazy thing to, allow to run you. And, our focus is trying to be intentional. Our focus is trying to get out of hardship and use hardship to be that ease. Like, hardship with ease, One of the other points I want to bring in is this concept of self-worth. And let's say you take the advice, you somehow figure out, because I didn't give you like a game plan, I didn't give you no tools this time, but you somehow figure it out, like, you know what, yep, that was ego and I need to move out of that, right? There comes a point that you feel very shaky, right? And it's so tempting to go back to whatever actions you were doing before. And one thing I want to say is, like, you don't have that self-trust in your being. And, if you want to know how to solve that issue, go listen to the actions and values episode. Those 2 episodes kind of are more tool-based about how to actually build up your life. This episode is more focused on, that identification and the reflection of, oh shit, I got an ego, oopsie. But yeah, like, if you know you don't trust yourself, if you're constantly looking at that mirror, looking at that image, or deluding yourself into so much self-trust that you're not reality-based anymore, you're just, in Delulu town, you gotta come back. You have to reimagine, re-envision, and you can be completely grounded. The other thing I'll say is, if you're, like, struggling right now, like, oh my god, is all of me ego? Is everything about me ego? I like having good grades. Does that make me, like, egotistic and, like, ego-centered? No. I think it's more of, 2 split sides. One, when you're interacting with other people and you're allowing the ego to, like, fight people, essentially, and fight back, that's a no-no. And then the other section is when you lose bad because you tied everything to ego and identity. So you're going to internally feel like shit because you're losing so bad, and then externally you can lash out and, like, become Kanye, essentially. Not to that level, but being so pushed and so far from reality, because that's the best way you can protect yourself. So, one, taking responsibility, and we'll figure out how to do that. Maybe I'll have an episode on how to take responsibility, because I barely know how to do that myself. But just understanding that praise, anything on paper that you're not acting upon, and you turn that into your identity, that becomes ego, in my opinion. That's why a lot of us have ego. So just rechecking yourself, sitting back and saying, like, okay, what are things that I'm putting identity first, action second, and where am I going wrong with that? And I will say, like, if you ever read Atomic Habits, because I feel like that's a book people tell you to read, and I read like half of that, the advice in that book essentially is like, oh, make your whole thing identity, because then you'll do it. No, you'll feel guilt, and guilt will come out of, like, guilt comes out of all these things. You will have guilt, and ego will be your coping mechanism response. So you just have to step out of that. Okay, we'll summarize it. Let's, like, cut it off here because I feel like I'm rambling at this point. But yes, ego is a mechanism of coping and self-defense, and it's really rooted in this perception of how you should be viewed and how you should be treated, right? And how you view yourself. Like, it's a mirror, essentially, or a huge checklist you have that you don't really know you have. And it's continuously either validated externally, or your identity is tied to things that are external and not internal. And that's why you can really struggle throughout life, and ego becomes bigger and bigger the more that you feel these things being threatened, right? Especially if you root your identities outside of yourself and those external factors. The more threatened you feel, the more ego comes out to protect you, and that's how you fall into that superiority and inferiority complex, because if it didn't matter, you would not care. You could call me, I'll just say crazy things on this mic, not really not say that, but you could call me a liar, and when I was younger, I would be very aggressive and angry about that, because I used to really, really hate when, like, I was told that I was a liar, because I believed, like, I am truthful. I'm a truthful person. And because I identified so strong with the identity and not the concept of, like, I don't lie, bro, I would get in that, like, superiority complex, that inferiority complex, that lashing out, because I'm like, how dare you try to tell me about who I am, because I have this on my wall that says I'm not a liar. Like, chillax. Like, that's kind of like the biggest advice, is just really trying to remove your identity from those factors and try to put them into something a little more, how you say, values. Yeah, go listen to the value episode. Just like 5 times saying that, we can start counting. But, like, identifying with things that internally, no matter where you are, they still matter. Like, if you're like, I don't really lie, you're not going to, and maybe once in a while you do like, dang, I lied. Oops, like, that's a mess up. You're not really, oh my god, I'm now a liar. You don't be like, I did that thing once, now I'm a liar. And the other half is like, ego doesn't come up and be like, well, I am truthful, I just lied that one time. You don't take responsibility. No, baby, take responsibility. You lied, but that doesn't make you a liar. Anyways, you get the point, you get the gist of all of that. And lastly, like, you are beautiful. You are psych. I'm not about to give you a bunch of, like, we just talked about fake validation. I'm not validating y'all. But what I am going to validate is you sat through this whole episode, you listened, hopefully you learned. And if you did all of that, you are on a space or journey to start, like, you know, rationalizing and re-looking at yourself and keeping your ego in check. Because we all try to keep our ego in check. And I'm not going to lie, my ego does come out. I know that. And I need to work on that. And hopefully you're working on it too. Alright. Thanks, y'all. See you next time.